So once you've met an investor likes you, you like the investor, you've given them the pitch, you've gone through that kind of early stage getting to know each other process, you're then usually, as you start to kind of ramp up the discussions, the first checkpoint then will be a term sheet. And a term sheet's a great point for a founder because it kind of validates that a deal is potentially, and in my experience, probably going to happen if you can get through that term sheet and align. The investors will have done a lot of heavy lifting prior to that more often than not. The first thing a founder's going to look for is valuation, and there's not a lot I can really kind of tell you to help guide what that valuation number is if you're a pre-seed or seed stage business. There's a million different methodologies that you can use, but ultimately it's usually going to come down to a bit of a subjective view between what the founders think the business is worth and what the investors does, and then usually a little bit of a negotiation. The one thing that is useful though is to try and look past just the valuation. There will be other economic terms in there that will influence your ultimate ownership percentage. So option pool is one of them. So usually investors will look for an option pool to be created to incentivize future hires. You usually see a lot of alignment with founders on that, right? Everyone wants to get the best talent into their business. Part of the bit where there does become a discussion is that option pool going to come in pre the round or post the round? If it's pre the round, then it's hitting existing investors. If it's post the round, then it's hitting existing and new investors in terms of that dilution. So that's one factor. The size of the option pool is obviously important. Around 10% is average, but it will depend upon how many founders you've got, how many people you've already hired, all that other good stuff. So you need to consider that. But I'd say if it's way out of that kind of probably 8 to 12 range, then I'd start to ask some kind of additional questions as to why. It might be right for your business, but it's just something to think about. You also have what's called preference shares, and there's kind of various different ways they can be structured. So investors might just invest into the ordinary class of shares and take the same risk as the founders. They might look for what's called a non-participating preference, where they either get their cash back first or they share in the pro rata. And then you've got what's called a participating preference, which is a little bit of a double dip usually, and not always the most palatable for founders, where an investor will both get their cash back and they will share in their pro rata at an exit event. So depending on which of the three you've got there, that actually might be a bigger influence than the valuation. So yeah, that's another piece to think about, and you can have kind of fractional, singular or multiple preferences depending on which you go for. So that's an area that if I was a founder, I'd spend a lot of time looking at. In terms of the economic terms, you've also potentially got fees that some investors will charge for the capital that they invest. They may charge an upfront fee, they may charge an ongoing fee, they may charge both. They will also more often than not look to recoup their due diligence costs. So again, if someone's spending $5,000 on due diligence and another investor's spending 25, then obviously that's more cash that's ultimately coming out of the business and coming out of the round, which is kind of why I go back to the point about not all valuations are equal. I've seen term sheets where someone's got a slightly lower valuation, but there's no fees, no preference structures, minimal due diligence. Actually, you could be left with a bigger percentage of your business after the round with that than if it was slightly higher valuation, but you've got all the other bits levered in. So that's one thing to think about in terms of economic terms. In terms of kind of what's called control terms, you've got things like, does an investor want a board seat? Quite a lot of lead investors do, especially in this climate. Does an investor require anyone else to come on the board? So sometimes they might look for an independent non-exec or an independent chair. There'll be investor consent rights ordinarily, so key matters that are reserved for the investors. So as an example, if you're currently selling to a certain type of customer in a certain location and you want to do a massive pivot to do something different, sell completely, start again, do a different product, obviously an investor's going to want some control over that. And there's other things within there. It doesn't always have to be massive things, but ordinarily the more kind of strategic changes they'll want some oversight on. It's not saying you can't do that, but an investor consent basically means you've got to get your investor on board before you make a big change to the business plan. So yeah, they're kind of the key things to look out for on more of the control side. One of the things I would say is get feedback as early as possible. Obviously, you should have a lawyer appointed, definitely for the business's interest, but sometimes you might want someone for the business's interest and the founder's interests, which might not always necessarily be the same if you've already been out and raised a couple of rounds. So get a lawyer appointed very early on. Obviously, they'll be able to give you more one-to-one advice. And I would say try and get them pre a term sheet. One of the places where I've seen founders really trip up in the past is they sign a term sheet and then they appoint a lawyer. That's actually quite difficult because sometimes a term sheet will include exclusivity and being on the hook for any abort costs if a founder pulls out of that transaction. So by the time you've signed it, you've kind of given away a lot of your leverage, especially if you've got multiple term sheets. Whereas if you've got a lawyer that you're working with that's got experience in early stage VC deals, they'll be able to both give you a view of what the market is, and two, they should be able to simplify those term sheets for you and almost give you a read across of, well, actually, the economic terms are better in this, the control terms are better in this, and kind of really break it down so you can understand as a founder what's the most important thing to you and how do you select for the right term sheet there. There's other bits of advice that you can take, obviously founder to founder. Feedback is really useful as well, especially if it's later stage businesses that have kind of already gone through that. But yeah, the big one is get a lawyer appointed as early as you can.